For decades, we viewed forgiveness as a nice, religious suggestion. But modern neuroscience has made a startling discovery. The brain is hardwired for the gospel. When we study the life of Joseph, we aren't just looking at an ancient Egyptian success story. We are looking at a clinical study of how a human being survives catastrophic trauma without letting it destroy his physiology. The thesis: before psychology existed, God gave Joseph a neural override. If Joseph had lived in bitterness, he would have died in that prison, not from a lack of food, but from a broken heart caused by chronic stress. For centuries, the pulpit and the laboratory stood on opposite sides of a great chasm. We viewed forgiveness as a lofty religious ideal, a spiritual gift we gave to those who didn't deserve it. We viewed the Bible as a book of ancient morals and psychology as a modern science of the mind. But today, we are witnessing a breathtaking convergence. We are discovering that the Word of God is not just a guide for the afterlife, it is a biological manual for the preservation of this life. When we open the book of Genesis to study the life of Joseph, we aren't just reading a Sunday school story about a colorful coat. We are analyzing a clinical case study of a man who survived a triple threat of catastrophic trauma. You cannot lead a nation if you are a slave to your past. In the narrative of Genesis 37, we witness a scene that is as chilling today as it was 4 millennia ago. Joseph, a 17-year-old boy, is sent by his father to check on his brothers. He approaches them, likely with a heart full of naivety, only to be met with a conspiracy of silence and blood. They strip him of the coat that symbolized his father's favor, and they cast him into a dry cistern, a pit. From a psychological perspective, what Joseph experienced was not merely a physical assault, it was a catastrophic attachment trauma. In the developmental architecture of the human mind, our family is supposed to be our primary secure base. When that base becomes the source of our terror, the brain undergoes a profound transformation. When his brothers turned on him, his brain was instantly flooded with a chemical storm. The amygdala, the brain's radar for threats, went into a state of permanent red alert. In this moment of betrayal, the brain shifts its resources away from the hippocampus, memory and learning, and the prefrontal cortex, the seat of wisdom, atrophies, and our DNA begins to show signs of premature aging and inflammation. For many of us, the pit isn't a literal hole in the ground in Dothan. It is the moment a spouse walked out, a business partner embezzled funds, or a parent turned cold. This is the trauma of betrayal, and it creates a neurological loop where the brain keeps replaying the event, trying to find a way to make it safe. If you stay in this loop, you develop what psychology calls hypervigilance, a state where you can no longer trust anyone because your brain believes every brother is a potential predator. What did Joseph have to learn in the darkness of that pit? To survive, he had to master a concept that modern psychology calls self-defensiation. In the pit, Joseph had to make a silent spiritual choice. Is my identity defined by the brothers who threw me in here, or by the God who gave me the dream? If Joseph had allowed his brain to fuse with his trauma, he would have become a victim. And here is the neurological truth about the victim mindset. A victim brain cannot innovate. A brain stuck in survival mode is incapable of the strategic, high-level thinking required to eventually manage the grain of Egypt. The Bible shows us that even as he was pulled out of the pit and sold to the Midianites, Joseph began the grueling process of neural decoupling. He had to decouple his sense of worth from his circumstances. He learned that favor is not a garment you wear, but a state of the soul. He refused to let the pit become his internal landscape. Before he ever learned to lead Egypt, he had to learn to lead his own internal emotional response. He had to learn that while he could not control the actions of his brothers, he was the absolute ruler of his own perspective. After the trauma of the pit, we find Joseph in Egypt. He is no longer the favorite son. He is a slave in the house of Potiphar. Yet the scripture tells us something remarkable. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. Genesis 39:2. Joseph had risen from the ashes, mastered a new language, and worked his way up to become the overseer of an entire estate. But just as he found stability, the unthinkable happened. He acted with perfect integrity by refusing the advances of Potiphar's wife, and in return for his righteousness, he was falsely accused and thrown into the king's prison. To understand the weight of this moment, we must look at how God designed the human brain to perceive justice. Modern neuroscience has utilized fMRI scans to observe the brain's reaction to unfair treatment. Researchers discovered that when a person is treated unfairly, the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, and the insula light up with intense activity. Here is the shocking part. These are the exact same regions of the brain that process physical pain. When Joseph was being led away in chains for a crime he didn't commit, his brain wasn't just experiencing bad thoughts, it was experiencing the neurological equivalent of a physical beating. This is why social pain feels so real. The brain views a breach of justice as a threat to survival. This creates a powerful biological drive for revenge. The brain demands a payback to settle the neural inflammation caused by the injustice. Joseph faced a choice that every victim of injustice faces. Will I allow this unfairness to become a permanent neural fire in my mind? If Joseph had surrendered to the natural urge for revenge, his brain would have entered a state of chronic allostatic load. This is what happens when the stress of holding a grudge keeps the body's emergency brake from ever being engaged. Over time, high levels of cortisol actually cause the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning, foresight, and impulse control, to shrink. Had Joseph obsessed over the unfairness of Potiphar's wife, he would have literally lost the cognitive ability to manage a prison, let alone a nation. But Joseph practiced the discipline of integrity. Integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when people are watching. It is about maintaining a unified mind when everything is falling apart. By choosing to remain faithful to God's standards even in an unfair situation, Joseph was practicing what we now call cognitive reframing. He refused to let the unfairness pain dictate his behavior. He kept his neural executive center online. He chose to act as a steward of his current environment rather than a prisoner of his past grievances. Before he could ever wear the signet ring of Pharaoh, he had to prove that he could maintain his internal integrity while his external world was profoundly unjust.
From the heights of Potiphar's estate, Joseph is plunged into the darkness of the king's dungeon. This is perhaps the most dangerous phase of Joseph's journey. In the pit, the trauma was acute and fast. In Potiphar's house, it was an issue of integrity. But in the prison, the enemy is time. Day after day, year after year, Joseph sat in a cell for a crime he did not commit. Even when he helped the chief cupbearer and asked only to be remembered, he was met with a deafening 2-year silence. In the 1960s, psychologists identified a phenomenon known as learned helplessness. It occurs when a human or animal is subjected to repeated stressful stimuli from which they cannot escape. Eventually, the brain learns that effort is futile. The dorsal raphe nucleus in the brainstem becomes hyperactive, signaling to the rest of the brain that it should simply give up. This is the state where many people lose their inner fire. Their dopamine production tanks, their motivation vanishes, and they sink into a clinical depression. Joseph was in the perfect environment for his brain to shut down. If Joseph had succumbed to learned helplessness, he would have spent those years staring at a wall waiting to die. But the Bible tells us Joseph did something counterintuitive. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph. Instead of withdrawing into a shell of self-pity, Joseph began to serve. He noticed the fallen faces of his fellow prisoners. He listened to their dreams. He cared for their needs. From a neurobiological standpoint, Joseph was using altruism to save his own brain. When we help others, our brain releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and dopamine. These chemicals act as a buffer against cortisol. By serving in the prison, Joseph was literally hacking his own neurochemistry. He kept his social brain active and his mood regulated. Why is waiting in bitterness so destructive? When we harbor a desire for revenge while we are powerless to act on it, our brain stays in a state of incomplete fight-flight. We are revving the engine of our nervous system while the car is in park. This creates massive internal wear and tear. Joseph had to learn the neurobiology of trust. In the Bible, this is called waiting on the Lord. It is the ability to maintain a calm, regulated nervous system even when the justice you seek is delayed. Joseph's years in prison were not lost years. They were a training ground for his vagus nerve. He was learning to find peace in the presence of God, independent of his physical location. He had to learn that the prison was not a dead end, but a waiting room. Because he kept his brain healthy through service and trust, he was ready. When Pharaoh finally called, Joseph didn't emerge with the brain fog of a long-term prisoner. He emerged with the clarity of a king.
Joseph's journey culminates in a moment of staggering contrast. In a single day, he is summoned from the dungeon, shaven, clothed in fine linen, and placed on the second throne of the most powerful empire on earth. He is given the signet ring of Pharaoh. He has gone from a slave with no rights to a ruler with the power of life and death. But the true palace test does not happen when he interprets Pharaoh's dreams. It happens years later, when a famine brings 10 men to their knees before him, the very brothers who threw him into the pit. When Joseph sees his brothers, his brain is subjected to a massive neural trigger. In an instant, the hippocampus pulls the files from 20 years ago, the screams in the pit, the tearing of the coat, the coldness in their eyes. His amygdala likely screams for justice. This is the test of power. For the first time in his life, Joseph has the biological and political capacity to settle the score. From a neurobiological perspective, revenge is often a primitive attempt to balance the scales of the nervous system. The brain believes that by inflicting pain on those who hurt us, our own pain centers will finally shut off. But this is a biological lie. Research shows that people who seek revenge actually stay stuck in the trauma longer. They keep the wound open by constantly ruminating on the offender. Joseph does something fascinating. He doesn't forgive them instantly. He tests them. He observes their character. In this, we see the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, ruling over his emotions. He is not acting out of a trauma response. He is acting out of divine strategy. Then comes the breaking point in Genesis 45. Joseph can no longer restrain himself. He weeps so loudly that the entire palace hears him. This is the neural discharge. Psychologically, this is the moment the trauma loop is finally broken. By choosing to forgive, Joseph is performing a neural override on his own survival instincts. He looks at the men who destroyed his youth and says, "Do not be distressed, for God sent me before you to preserve life." When Joseph reframes his trauma as God's providence, he is practicing what we now call narrative integration. Trauma causes memories to stay fragmented and raw in the emotional brain. Forgiveness, however, allows the brain to move that memory into the narrative part of the brain. It becomes a story Joseph tells, not a pain he relives. By forgiving his brothers, Joseph effectively decluttered his internal hard drive. He freed up the massive amounts of mental energy that were previously spent guarding against the past. This is why he was able to lead Egypt through a 7-year crisis with such clarity. He wasn't distracted by the internal noise of bitterness. The Bible knew before psychology that you cannot carry the weight of a crown while carrying the weight of a grudge. Forgiveness was Joseph's final step into true kingship.
He didn't forgive them because they were good. He forgave them because he refused to let their past sins occupy his future palace.
The life of Joseph is not just an ancient biography. It is a spiritual and biological roadmap for every person sitting in a pit of their own today. The transition from hatred to domination, from being a victim of your past to becoming a ruler of your future, requires a conscious physiological shift. If we want to step into the authority God has for us, we must apply the Joseph protocol to our own neural pathways. The first step is realizing that your bitterness is not an asset, it is a biological debt. Every moment you spend in a state of unforgiveness, you are paying interest in the form of elevated blood pressure, sleep deprivation, and a weakened immune system. You are literally giving the person who hurt you rent-free space in your brain. To move toward rulership, you must decide that your future is worth more than your right to be angry. Joseph's loud weeping in the palace was an acknowledgement of his pain. He didn't suppress it, he processed it so it wouldn't own him. In psychology, we call this reframing. In the Bible, we call it sovereignty. Joseph took the most painful data points of his life, the pit, the slavery, the prison, and he rewrote the file. He moved the story from "my brothers sold me" to "God sent me." When you do this, you are engaging the prefrontal cortex to override the amygdala. You are telling your nervous system, "I am safe." This was not a random tragedy, it was a divine curriculum. This shift shuts down the survival brain and activates the executive brain. You cannot rule a kingdom if you cannot regulate your own heart rate when you see your brothers, your triggers. Forgiveness is not a one-time emotional event. It is a hygiene for the soul and the mind. Jesus taught us to pray, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." This is a daily reset. If you don't clear the cache of your daily grievances, the system will eventually crash. Joseph had to release the debt his brothers owed him so that he could be light enough to climb to the throne. The ultimate goal of this neurobiological journey is to reach a state of domination. This is not just power over others, but power over yourself. A true ruler is a person who is no longer reacting to the world, but responding from a place of internal peace. When you forgive, you take the signet ring back from your past. You stop allowing your trauma to dictate your biochemistry. You move from the survival mode of the prison to the creation mode of the palace. Like Joseph, you begin to see that the evil done against you was merely the raw material God used to build the platform for your purpose.
The life of Joseph serves as a profound biological shadow of the ultimate reality found in Jesus Christ. While Joseph saved a nation from physical famine through the power of forgiveness, Jesus saved humanity from the eternal famine of sin and the physiological decay of hatred. In the teaching of Jesus, we find the final confirmation that the Bible knew before psychology exactly what the human soul requires to remain whole. When Jesus hung upon the cross, subjected to the most extreme form of unfairness in human history, he uttered the most revolutionary neurobiological command ever recorded: "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Luke 23:34. From a psychological perspective, Jesus was breaking the infinite loop of trauma. In our fallen nature, the brain demands an eye for an eye. This creates a cycle where violence begets violence, and trauma begets trauma. By forgiving his executioners while the pain was still acute, Jesus demonstrated the sovereign override. He refused to let the mirror neurons of his brain reflect the hatred of his enemies. He stopped the transmission of evil in its tracks. When Peter asked Jesus if he should forgive a brother 7 times, Jesus responded with a number that implies infinity: 70 times 7. Matthew 18:22. Jesus wasn't just giving a moral command, he was prescribing a lifestyle of continuous neural reset. He knew that if we allow grievances to sit overnight, they begin to form synaptic chains of bitterness. By commanding us to forgive 70 times 7, he was instructing us to never let the cortisol settle. He was teaching us to keep our social brain open and our hearts soft, even in a world that is hard. Jesus understood that the heart, the center of our being, must be guarded above all else, for once it is hardened by unforgiveness, the light in us, our cognitive and spiritual clarity, turns to darkness. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus links our own forgiveness directly to the forgiveness we extend to others. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Matthew 6:12. This is the ultimate psychological truth. You cannot experience grace while you are withholding it. Biologically, the brain cannot be open to receive peace while it is clenched to withhold mercy. It is a neurological impossibility. If the survival brain is busy calculating the debt of another, it cannot be in growth mode to receive the healing of God. Jesus teaches us that the way to the palace, to the resurrection life, is through the death of the ego's right to revenge. He shows us that when we forgive, we are not letting someone off the hook. We are letting ourselves out of the cage. We are choosing to align our biology with the kingdom of God rather than the kingdom of darkness. As we conclude this journey from Joseph's pit to Pharaoh's palace, remember that the same spirit that empowered Joseph to weep over his brothers is the same spirit that empowered Jesus to die for his enemies. That spirit is available to you today to rewire your brain, heal your trauma, and set you free from the physical and spiritual prison of the past. Don't drink the poison of rage any longer. Breathe in the oxygen of grace. Your brain, your body, and your destiny depend on it.